Which is as complete as possible on today's issue, which is, as you see on the paper, recycling the emperor. The question of the emperor, the Japanese emperor, of course, at the end of the war. And we have many clips to show this, and furthermore, at the end of the course, we had the first presentation by the students. So I will start immediately on the issue emperor. So what I will tell you in the general presentation you will have right now is borrowed from the book by John Dower, this book, John Dower. This book, Embracing Defeat, which is very essential book about what we are talking here. That is all what has something in common with Japan in the aftermath of the war. So, okay, many citations, quotations from this book, what I will say is inspired by the book. Until the surrender of Japan, the emperor was the heart and soul of the ideological indoctrination in the Japanese population. He, the emperor, was venerated as descending directly from the sun goddess Amaterasu. This cult of the emperor, who was supposed to embody the spirit, the uniqueness, and the unity of the Japanese people, this made of Japan a theocracy, alien to any form of democratic culture. Japanese people were supposed to be the obedient subjects of the emperor. Piety and loyalty were the supreme virtues of the imperial state. Any decision by the emperor was sacred and indisputable. And this is the way the war, as the emperor very obviously took responsibility for it after Pearl Harbor, became holy for the Japanese population as a whole and for the soldiers in particular. I add something here. One of the documents I made available, you will see there's a picture. It's a flyer, a leaflet, praising the Axis, that is the alliance between Mussolini, Hitler, and Japan. And you will notice on this picture, you have the portraits of Hitler, Mussolini, but not the emperor. Instead of the emperor, it's Mount Fuji. Why? Because the emperor, according to these Japanese representations, is not at the same level as these, let's say, leaders, political leaders. He belongs to another category since he is a god. Okay. From the very beginning of the occupation of Japan, so at the end of the war, it was General MacArthur's, that is the American propaganda in Japan. It is MacArthur's strategy to detach the emperor from the Holy War. That is to clear him of any charge or any responsibility for the attack against the US and the invasion of Southeast Asia, or also for the war crimes perpetrated by the Imperial Army. But it was even more than that, to set him up at the center of Japan's new post-war democracy. Tojo, Prime Minister, at the beginning of the war, Japanese Prime Minister at the beginning of the war, Tojo, and the so-called militarist clique, A-class criminals, these people were sentenced to death at the Tokyo trial in order, explicitly, in order to protect the emperor and to make him escape any kind of investigation about his role in Japan's aggression war in the Pacific and in East Asia. Justice was rendered at the Tokyo trial very arbitrarily. Progressively, from August 1945, that is the time of end of August, the time of the famous radio speech by Hirohito, the emperor, announcing that Japan laid the arms down. So from this day to 1948, that is, as the criminals sentenced at the Tokyo trial were hung. During this period, the emperor was redefined as symbol of the state and of the unity of the Japanese people. He was, that was said, re-mythologized personally as a descendant of the sun goddess, and this by the Japanese conservative press and under the influence of the reactionary and traditionalist circles who worked hard at that time to preserve the integrity of the monarchy and of the emperor. And this in full agreement with the occupation authorities. General Fellers, we have already met him in the film Emperor. Fellers was one of the most active agents of this restoration of the prestige of the emperor, and this under new democratic conditions. After the defeat, at the time of the occupation, and as Japan was making its first steps on the road to democracy, the emperor remained the incarnation of the putative racial purity, as well as of the cultural homogeneity of the Japanese people. That is what is supposed to make out of this people a family nation, the famous Yamato spirit or Japanese identity, which makes that any kind of alien, of whatever ethnic origin, that is Korean people, Taiwanese people, Chinese people, living in Japan, of course, cannot ever become Japanese, even if their family has been living in Japan for decades and decades. And this is, as you maybe know, this is a very sensitive issue today, as ultra-nationalist groups go and parade in districts, in big cities, not only Tokyo, in districts, people by Koreans, that is people from Korean origin, that is families from Korean origins who are some very often living in Japan for ages. And these nationalist, ultra-nationalist groups go there shouting slogans like all Koreans out, or even sometimes kill the Koreans. So it is important to remember that after the war, Hirohito, the emperor, kept being the supreme icon of genetic separateness and blood nationalism in Japan. In terms of values and norms, MacArthur's strategy consisted in putting into practice this motto, this notion. Everything in Japan has to change, that is, Japan has to pass from theocracy to democracy so that nothing changes in terms of obedience, submissiveness of the ordinary people to the authority of political power, that is, of the state. For this reason, the loyalty of the brand new democratic citizens to the emperor, this had to be kept intact. General Fellas confessed that he was always fascinated by the intensity of Japanese loyalty. That means, of course, loyalty to superior authority, to leaders, to the state, to the institutions. And, of course, in particular, fascinated by Japanese military discipline. In order to implement this strategy, MacArthur and his team had to invent and promote a legend. They had to make up a myth. And this legend, this myth, is this. On the verge of the war and during the war, the militarist clique has confiscated power. They have duped the people. They have betrayed the emperor. The emperor did not know about the preparations for the attack on Pearl Harbor. He did not support it. He was then confined in a pure symbolic, honorific, and formal role. He has not presided over the aggression against the United States. He was the hostage of the militarist, ultranationalist party. He was, let's say, lost, completely lost in international politics. He was shut up in his palace, etc. So this is the first part. This is the first part of this useful construction, or if you prefer, of this useful political life. The second part is about what would probably happen if the emperor would be indicted and tried as a war criminal, and he would maybe hang. So what would happen? General Fellas was very active in the promotion of the state, wrote at that time, hanging the emperor would be to them, that is to Japanese people, comparable to the crucifixion of Christ to us. All would fight, all the Japanese people, all of them, would fight to die like ants. The war would be unduly prolonged and losses heavier than otherwise would be necessary. In the same spirit, some months later, MacArthur wrote to his superiors in Washington, that is at the time, as the US political authority was pushing hard in direction of an indictment of the emperor. So MacArthur at that time wrote that if it happened, that is, if the emperor would be tried, etc. So these are quotations. A tremendous convulsion would come over the Japanese population. A vendetta for revenge for the punishment of the emperor would take place. And even civilized practices will largely cease, MacArthur wrote. Guerrilla warfare would be expected, and all hopes of introducing modern democracy would disappear. And of course, this is the political international background, very important point. The Soviet Union and the local communists would be ready to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. So all this meaning at the end, and to sum up, if you, and this being addressed to the politicians, the ruling people in Washington, if you do this, if you put the emperor on trial, if you kill him, you, the politicians in Washington, you will have to send some 100,000 soldiers, American soldiers more, to Japan. And it, of course, it will cost a lot of money to the state and to every citizen. So you can pretty well imagine that this kind of political blackmail was at that time rather efficient and convincing of those whom it was addressed. So Washington did not stick to his views, and MacArthur was free to continue to set up imperial democracy. And it is not worthy here that the method of the, what I call the useful lie, this is not from Laura, this is my expression, useful lie. So this method used here by General MacArthur, by the general and his think tank, this is exactly the same as that which was put into circulation in the context of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We can call it, we may call it, the no alternative method. What does that mean? At the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the useful lie consisted in saying, we had no choice. If we do not, or if we had not dropped this super deterrent or these super deterrent bombs, we would have had to invade Japan by fighting bitterly for every piece of land. The Japanese army and the population will fight or would have fought to death, and the human cost of it will be or would have been overwhelming, not only for us Americans, for our soldiers, but for the Japanese population as well. We Americans will lose or would have lost at least 500,000 more men, maybe more, 1 million. This was about the numbers which were mentioned at that time. So, of course, the reasoning was, the end of the reasoning was, let's finish this war once for all, and for this, unfortunately, the only way to do it is to use this Armageddon new weapon. I think there's no need to deal at length with this sophistry, the sophistry of the speech in defense of the barbarian decision to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what matters here for us, for our subject, is, let's say, the form of the argumentation which excludes any kind of debate or any kind of democratic dispute on it. The no choice, no alternative form is a full stop, it is no discussion. MacArthur and fellows' argumentation on the question of the emperor's fate is exactly of the same brand. No alternative, no discussion, and this is, of course, a typical military, let's say, military way of discussing or arguing without discussing or arguing. But we see, of course, in both cases, that is Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the emperor issue, that being military, it still runs over in the field of political and not mainly military decision. And this in a context, of course, as politics are placed under the sign of exception, that is, of the state of exception, the end of the war. So MacArthur's and fellows' idea was not only to save the emperor in order to avoid that a gulf appears between yesterday's and today's Japan. But their idea, their main idea, was to use the emperor. And this, they said, I think MacArthur said, to further our aims, to serve our aims. Fellows said that. and to make out of him, out of the emperor, a force for good and peace. They saw the emperor as a factor of stability and as well as a dam against the radicalization of the Japanese society, or of some sectors of it, which would mean a risk of communization of the country. Fellows who had been studying the Japanese society already from the 20s was convinced that it had been, like any Oriental society, it has been socialized to kowtow to authority. And from this angle, the emperor had to be considered as a trump, a token of continuity. On this, we could compare what fellows say with what Ruth Benedict writes in her classic book, The Sword and the Chrysanthemum. Through Hirohito only, MacArthur thought, would it be possible to maintain a completely orderly government? And this is the reason why the legend of the emperor as a magnanimous peacemaker, that is, having taken the courageous decision of the capitulation, and this against the will of the militarist gang. This is the reason why this legend had to be coined. This way, the throne would be redefined as the centerpiece of the new democracy. To this end, the imperial system had to be updated and made compatible with the democratic system and with the American occupation. For this reason, MacArthur met the emperor very rapidly. The famous picture, the photo I gave you, which was shot on this occasion, establishes distinctly MacArthur's authority and preeminence. Not only that he's taller, but in terms of age, he could have been the latter's father. He was in his 60s and the emperor was in his 40s. But simultaneously, it demonstrates his, this is Dawa's expression, his receptivity to the emperor. That is, it clearly, this photo, this picture, clearly meant that from this moment on, Hirohito was placed under the protection of the province. The second well-known and spectacular step in the updating process of the Japanese monarchy was Hirohito's renunciation of his divine status. That is, his statement, it's called rescript, about his becoming human. He became human. This metamorphosis was very actively prepared by the Americans, not by the Japanese side, but by American scholars, military experts, who prepared a draft for the rescript of the emperor, people working with MacArthur's staff. And it included a very partial rejection of the imperial ideology and mythology. This statement, this rescript, imperial rescript, states that the ties between us, that is the emperor, and the nation do not depend only upon myth and legends. It rejects the notion of a Japanese racial superiority, not homogeneity, but only superiority. But on the other hand, in his so-called Declaration of Humanity, the emperor doesn't give up explicitly the myth of an unbroken imperial line tracing back to the sun goddess. one more directly political, on more directly political issues, he never, and this is very important, he never offered to assume responsibility for the war. And this contrarily to a persistent, stubborn, and once again, useful, of course, legend. We will see this again in the film Emperor. On the contrary, he accepted, in the context of the trial, he accepted to lay the onus for disastrous policies. This is from Dawa. Disastrous policies that led to the defeat on Japan, to lay the onus on his subordinates, who had to be hung after the trial. It was urgent for MacArthur to change the emperor's image and to dress him in new clothes. For at that time, 70% of American people favored executing or at least punishing him harshly. On the other hand, outside pressure in favor of his indictment was constantly growing at the time. And this from countries like China, Australia, the Philippines, the Soviet Union, and for good and obvious reasons. At the time, he was a god. The emperor had been literally devoid of all ordinary human contact, of any ordinary human contact. It was forbidden to touch him. Even his doctors, his tailor, his servants were not allowed to have any direct physical contact with him. Though John Howard adds ironically, his wife maybe yes. Okay, I guess. He lived secluded in his palace. He had no contact with foreigners or with ordinary people. He did not know how to open the door or to get dressed by himself. For this reason, he was a complete social idiot. Not a fool, for, we can see from the way he knew at the crucial moment how to adapt himself very quickly to completely new circumstances at the time of the occupation, and how he became resilient and malleable in order to, let's say, pass the test imposed on him by the dictator and to save his position and his life by the same token. After his declaration of humanity, he began to travel under the protection of the American troops. He began to travel through his devastated country. This in Western Chile. He went to meet his people he had never seen. These imperial tours attracted large crowds, since the monarch had transformed himself into what Dawa calls a celebrity. That is, a former god having become a celebrity, looking like, or having the statues from this moment on, having the same statues as, let's say, the famous actor from Hollywood. You will see this in Sokolov's film. But his complete social ineptitude did not diminish all this. He never was able to talk to ordinary people. An example of that given by Dawa is his visit to Hiroshima. So he paid a visit to Hiroshima, and there, watching the ruins of the city, he uttered this very pathetic platitude. There seems to have been considerable damage here. So this showing that it's really not very easy to turn from a god into a human, even a special one. So, in his book, and this is also a key issue, in his book, John Dewar strongly objects to MacArthur's and Fellows' argument, according to which the Japanese population would join forces to reject any treatment of the emperor as a criminal by, and treatment of that kind by, of course, the occupation authorities. Fellows, especially, had put in a lot of effort to convince his superiors that the Japanese nation would consider it as a sacrilege to entertain the idea that the emperor is on a level with the people or any government officials. And for this reason, Fellows wrote, to try him as a criminal would not only be blasphemous, but a denial of spiritual freedom. Opinion surveys. Opinion surveys falls at the end of the war, at the beginning of the occupation, showed that 70% of the Japanese population at that time were, in spite of all, in favor of keeping the emperor in his position. But Dewar objects or notices that put in Japanese terms, that is according, let's say, to Japanese way of speaking or mentality, the emperor worship appears to have been in large part tatemai in Japanese, that is a facade. He insists on that in the vast majorities of general surveys of popular sentiments, general surveys on what people thought and felt at that moment. In these surveys, the emperor was invisible. He was not mentioned. He was a non-presence, Dewar says. People, and this is quite understandable, people were more concerned with food, with housing problems, than with the fate of the emperor. Dewar notes that in the last phase of the war, or immediately after, the number of incidents of lèse-majesté, all kinds of them, they increased, like bad or good jokes on the emperor, disrespectful remarks. We will see some examples of that in the films. And very interesting, in the wake of the war, this strange phenomenon, that is the appearance in various regions of Japan of imperial pretenders. That is people pretending that they were themselves the real emperor of Japan, that they were the legitimate descendants from the imperial divine lineage, having supporters too, and saying, of course, as a counterpart, that Hirohito was a fake, an impostor whose ascendant usurped the throne. Now, in general terms, Dewar objects to MacArthur and to Fellows' doomsday scenario, apocalyptic scenario, that is in case of suppression of the Japanese monarchy. Dewar objects to that in a, let's say, rather ironical tone, that a high mortality rate of monarchies. A high mortality rate of monarchies, this has been typical for the 20th century. And this all around the world, especially in Europe. And that it rarely happened, or maybe never, that the people who were concerned by these changes have risen up to save their monarch. So it is clear for the historian of Ottawa that keeping Hirohito in his position after the war, this was the effect of a pure political or instrumental calculation based on the alleged interests of the United States and not on, let's say, general speculations on Japanese culture, collective mentality, the attachment of the Japanese people to their monarch and so on and so on. Even in 1948, at the time the war trials came to the end, and Tojo and A-class war criminals were hung. Hirohito, even at that time, as late as that, Hirohito's abdication, the emperor's abdication, this would still have been an option. Imperial democracy could still have been saved and promoted under a new sovereign who would not have been responsible for the disasters and the crimes related to this war. But this very obviously was not MacArthur's scenario. This tame emperor and his human Western suit, this did suit MacArthur perfectly well. Now, to go back to cinema, briefly. If we consider the way American and Japanese movie makers work out in different fields, this emperor issue and this from very different angles, we can notice at least, let's say, two things, two important issues. For American directors, it seems to be difficult to take a distance from the legend which has been coined by MacArthur, Fellows, and others. Actually, what these films basically do, they print the legend. They print the legend. Why do I use this expression, they print the legend? Because it's classical in the realm of cinema. You maybe know this. At the end of a well-known Western film by John Ford, 1960, which is called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. At the end of this film, a local journalist in a small town of the West, it's a Western film of course, a local journalist knows pretty well that Liberty Valance, who is an outlaw, a villain, Liberty Valance has not been killed by the righter of wrongs who challenged him for a single combat and who has become after that, and for this reason, a hero for the local population. This journalist knows pretty well that actually Liberty Valance, who was very good at shooting, has not been shot by this good guy who is supposed to have shot him. He actually has been shot from behind and during this fight by another man. So the journalist asks, what should I print in my paper? Should I print the true story, which is not glorious at all, or but true, which is the truth, or should I maybe print the legend, which is what the people from the small city ones to here, which is what they stick to because they believe in heroes, they believe in guardian angels, and they need them badly. And the answer which comes at that moment from the man who represents the new authority in the town, liberated or purged from this dangerous outlaw, the answer is this. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And this sentence has become a classic in various domains of disciplines, cinema, of course, but journalism to communication, even philosophy. You can connect it very easily to what Hannah Arendt says about facts and opinion in between past and future. The legend becomes fact because people need to believe in it. It is this need, urgent need, which transforms an imaginary, embellished but completely distorted narrative of past facts into pure and simple facts, real facts. And after the legend has become fact, the true story is completely erased. It does not exist anymore. And this is exactly what happens about the emperor after the war. But we have to notice that from the angle of the truth, and from, let's say, the rights of the truth, I spoke already about another time, the case we are dealing with is much more dramatic than in John Ford's film. Because John Ford's film, it's a tape. It's a completely imaginary story located in the West in the aftermath of the conquest. But we hear about the emperor. We are talking about real history. We are talking about real events, real facts. And the films we have to deal with here, they distort these facts, they distort them for a simple, practical reason, which is that the filmmakers, directors, and all the people who take part in the manufacturing of these films, for all them, the legend has been coined by very authoritative people like MacArthur and others, and this way it has become stronger than the facts. It has become, let's say, fold in narration. It has become a habit, and it has become stronger than anything a professional historian or scholar like John Dower can say or recreate in a serious book like Embracing Defeat. So for these reasons and others, maybe, the filmmakers print the legend, and for the general public, then after that, for the general public who sees biopic about MacArthur by Joseph Sargent, I will show you a brief clip from it, with a well-known actor, Gregory Peck, as MacArthur. And Emperor, people, for the general public who sees these films, who do not, of course, read Dower's book, the legend becomes fact. And this shows that as a rule, let's say, in general, Hollywood as a manufacturer for historical narratives and contributing massively to fabricate collective memory, Hollywood tends to side with the political or with the military power. And in particular on, let's say, sensitive historical issues like this, the one we are talking about now. Of course, there exist many exceptions, and we saw it with a film like Come See the Parents. I don't want to generalize hastily, but this case here, this story about Emperor, this seems to me quite paradigmatic. But maybe I do not exclude that there exists some other films, even Hollywood films, which I don't know about, heard about, and which would contradict my statement. For this reason, I leave it somehow open. But still, when you see a film like Emperor, you can notice this. On one hand, it sticks to religion, it's very close to religion, let's say. But on the other, it takes past history as some kind of a playground on which it can frolic very freely. The example of that being all this story with the girlfriend, the Japanese girlfriend, which is completely invented, which is a gimmick, a narrative gimmick, and nothing else invented by the storyteller. If we now take another film, which I will show you parts of it, which is The Sun, by Alexander Sokolov, a Russian director. Then it's a completely different picture. It's completely different, we see. Because it is not from Hollywood. It's a part of a very ambitious trilogy on totalitarian power. 3 films. One on Hitler, another one Stalin, and this is the last one on Hirohito, the Emperor, The Sun. It's called The Sun. And it was for Sokolov a very complicated adventure. Russian, French, Italian, Swiss co-production. In this film, as you will see, what Sokolov is interested in is the issue of the downfall of an intangible living God into a very ordinary man. I mean ordinary in the way he behaves. As he's clumsy, so you will see that. Sokolov's film is a reflection on the loss by the emperor of his immunity as a sacred person and as the sacred body. He doesn't. After he has become human, he, literally speaking, does not know what to make out of his body, having become a human. And Sokolov's purpose is met, I must say, by fantastic, exceptional Japanese actor who embodies the emperor, Issei Koga. But even such a film, which is an artistic masterpiece, even such a film cannot emancipate completely from religion. Sokolov draws his inspiration from MacArthur's memories, at least partly. And as a consequence, you will see in the film, he backs up the part of the legend about the emperor proposing bravely, generously to take responsibility for the aggression against the US and the war crimes, which, as Bauer makes it very clear, is convincing on this issue, is very unlikely. As we shall see now, in the clips from the Japanese films, the transformation of the legend into fact this continues to be effective in Japan as a political dimension of common life, even decades after the end of the war. That is, the emperor as a political figure, as a symbol, cannot, even decades after the end of the war, since he is still there, since this continuity, this imperial continuity exists, the emperor cannot be directly, vehemently, openly criticized or challenged. And you will see that even in pacifist films, in anti-militarist films, in very distinctly engaged films from the 60s, 70s, the critique of the emperor always has to come like sideways, to be surreptitious, implicit, euphemistic, or to be conveyed by specific cinematic devices, so that things can appear clearly for the spectator, but without having to be said, without having to be directly, openly advocated. So in these films, in the most radical of these films, in the most engaged of these films, you will never find a direct political attack against the emperor. You will never find an imprecation. You will not find curses, no shouting slogans like hang him, hang the emperor, the hell with him. This doesn't exist. Because the red lines are still there, and the core or the condition of immunity of the sovereign has been preserved thanks to the Legion, thanks to MacArthur, the American option in favor of keeping him. And for this very reason, of course, it's a very exciting game to try and detect all the vague undermining of the emperor's authority and respectability in these films that will never appear openly. And these films commit themselves to that very stubbornly, but okay, to specific devices. Okay, so now we can pass to the film. So I just add something. So I prepared like some chapters, short chapters. The first is about MacArthur's Legion, the version of the MacArthur version of the story about the emperor. So in films. The second chapter is the meeting between the General MacArthur and the Emperor. The third one is the Emperor becomes human. The fourth is, it's about Japanese films. The name of the Emperor as a means or way of mobilization, of total mobilization during the war. And then next chapter, it's about the famous speech, capitulation speech of the emperor, which you can find in a lot of films. Then counter behaviors, that is critique of the empire, and this is it. So I will give you very brief comments of presentation. And this is from a film which is a biopic on MacArthur from Joseph Sargent. It was shot in 1977. And Joseph Sargent avoided in this film to make the expected scene, to stage the expected scene of the meeting between MacArthur and the emperor. Instead of that, MacArthur explains what he means, what his strategy or his tactics, is about the emperor. And then you have something very strange from emperor. So emperor, we already saw clips from it. It's a sequence where the ultranationalist clique, having heard that the emperor had prepared a speech intended for presenting the capitulation, they try to make a putsch and to attack the palace in order to steal the speech which has been recorded already, and even to kill the emperor. I must say that there is no trace of this episode in Dawar's book, so I don't know where he got this from, but okay, you will see it's very emphatic in emperor. Okay, so two clips on this first chapter. So this
The
man is
Supreme
an
Council convened
advisor
at
of the
midnight to
emperor.
discuss.
This is interesting because it's a typical American version of the emperor's speech, and it's basically wrong because they should never, these soldiers should never listen to it with their heads like that. Their heads should be down. So you will see, you can compare, you will compare with the Japanese version. People, of course, have to hold their heads down. So, okay, this is one example of, let's say, cultural dissent. This is completely wrong. But this is exactly MacArthur's version, and since it is expressed by the Japanese, it becomes stronger, of course. It's all very gloomy, green, okay, but it's on purpose. It's not that the copy is bad, it's the effect of it. What time is it? Yes, now we will pass to some Japanese films. We will not have time to go to the end, but still, I would like to show a few things. So, it's about the use of the name of the emperor during the war. So, the first clip is from a film which is called Hiroshima. It takes place in Hiroshima after the bombing of the city in the ruins. It's a film by Hideo Sekigawa, which has been shot in '53. So the first clip is very, very short. You will see it's people are refugees in the building, sitting in the building. There is a streamer, a banner, on which the name of the emperor is long live to the emperor. Okay. Nobody can answer anything to that, of course, in this context. So, okay, what time is it? Okay, 10 minutes. So now, okay, let's finish with Caterpillar. Caterpillar is a film by Koji Wakamatsu. It's recent. It's been shown like 4 or 5 years ago. So it's about a soldier from a village which was brought back to the village during the war. He's crippled, he has no more arms, legs. And okay, his wife has to take care of him. And there in this film, the use of the picture, of the portrait of the emperor, which is, okay, exactly an example of what I tried to say about the implicit use, critical use of the image of the emperor in such a film, which is a very anti-militarist film, not only pacifist, but very critical film. And this use of the picture of the emperor is one of the devices which is used for presenting the critical point of view, position. So you will have three clips. One is okay, the use of this picture in the soldier's house, and then a ceremony, a public ceremony, and then a song praising the emperor. Okay, so we shall stop here. And okay, have still, yes, have yes, many more to show, but it will be next time.